Hey, everybody. Welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be yet another great late night conversation. I'm back from Washington, D.C. I am now in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. As before, it was certainly a fruitful and productive trip. We've got another slideshow for you all tonight, going over some important concepts. So, yeah, let's do it. Glad to be back, everybody.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. Back in New York City. It's starting to feel like maybe a little bit of spring here in New York. Still got heavy winds, but it's not as cold as it once was. I'm glad to be back. Had a little couple day trip to DC. Didn't know what I was going for. I thought Zelensky and Trump were going to sign a deal for minerals, and that was the epic smackdown in the White House, and we'll be talking about that later. And tonight we're going to have a great slideshow presentation getting into some very, very important ideological issues that a lot of people don't understand about what we're doing, why we call for a government of action, why liberalism is in decline, what liberalism really is. It's going to be a lot of important stuff tonight. So we'll follow our usual format, which is I give opening remarks. And while I'm giving those remarks, people are sending in their questions, their comments, their concerns, their super chat or Rumble rant questions. Super chat on YouTube, Rumble rant on the Rumble. Then we do a roll call where we find out who is watching, names and locations. That's always exciting to find out, who's watching from around the country. Then the rest of the show is me answering your questions. So if there's something you would like me to touch on or comment on or talk about in the second half of the show, all you need to do is send me a super chat on YouTube or a Rumble rant on Rumble. The second half of the show is all you guys, so do your darndest, do your best. That's my request. Do your best. Get me talking about stuff. This show, it isn't just news commentary. I mean, we talk about the news, sure, but we get deeper. And that's what people really like about this program. We take things to a whole new and other level. So, get me talking. Now, we are having our national convention for the Center for Political Innovation in July. And it's going to be awesome. It is going to be in the great state of Illinois, in the city of Chicago. We have rented this beautiful auditorium, and we are having our event there. So if you would like to come, it would be great if you would register. It's going to be a great event. We're going to fill that auditorium with 400 people. It's going to be a mega anti-imperialist all-day conference and rally. I know David is coming all the way from Australia for it, and we got people coming from Minnesota. We got people flying in from California and from Massachusetts, and it's gonna be awesome. So you really ought to register. A lot of work is going to have to be done between now and July to make sure it's a success, but it will be a success. I am fully confident of that. We had a great Zoom call today. Center for Political Innovation. Every Saturday we have a Zoom call. And people are joining in light of our successful workshop in Minneapolis. We've had 5 or 6 new memberships that have come in. Become a member today. Just go to the website and sign up, become a member, and it's going to be awesome. So, I just wanted to throw that out there. We continue building, organizing, etc. So, if you like what we're doing, join the Center for Political Innovation. And tonight's broadcast will be in the normal format: opening remarks, followed by the roll call, and then I answer super chat and Rumble rant questions for the rest of the night. So think of a good question to ask me. Make the second half of the show just as good, if not better, than the first half. Now, just to catch everybody up while we're getting going here, right? Saturday night, people are trickling in, and come on in, come on in. So I went to Washington, D.C., and, I did a stream Thursday night from my hotel room. It was a smaller stream, just did it from my phone. I just kind of gave a fiery pep talk, and that was good because I was fired up. I'd been on the bus all day. I was in D.C., and Zelensky was meeting with Trump, and I told all of you that I was so proud to be in D.C. for the Trump-Zelensky meeting because I felt like we, as an organization, are a part of history. And boy, was I right. I had no idea how right I was. Folks, I was outside the White House as Trump and Zelensky were inside. And what happened inside was epic. What happened outside was very telling and informative. So while people are trickling in, I'm just going to show the video that I took from outside of the White House. Jimmy Dore showed a chunk of this on his broadcast yesterday. I know there's a lot of Dore fans in our community, and my phone lit up, yesterday evening because people were like, "Oh my God, they showed you on Jimmy Dore, Caleb. They showed your clip of the guy yelling at the Ukrainians." Well, thank you very much. You all are very welcome. I sure did that thing. This was what happened. This is me outside the White House, shows what happens inside the White House, etc. All right.
And y'all still talking about help Ukraine. And we got people that American, I can take you right around the corner, they're homeless veterans that can't get no help.
That's right.
But we got money for Ukraine. And then they gonna talk about when you say help Americans first, this is Russian propaganda. When you start talking about put Americans first is Russian propaganda. I mean, what more are we going to do for Ukraine? Let them account for the money that they don't know. What about the billions of dollars that's missing that they can't account for? And you still want more. I mean, come on, man. And yet Americans are suffering. Stay. Don't come over here, okay?
Inside the White House, Volodymyr Zelensky is getting a scolding from the President of the United States and the Vice President. Quite heated words. He's been accused of playing with the lives of millions. They've criticized him for not being grateful for all the support that the United States has offered to Ukraine. It is getting quite heated inside the meeting as the new administration does not seem to share the kind of blind admiration that Zelensky got from the previous administration in the White House. It's getting rather heated as J.D. Vance called out Zelensky for campaigning for his opponent in the election. This is quite an exciting moment where we're seeing a real shift in how the Ukrainian leader is treated inside the U.S. government and in the halls of power.
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you are not strong...
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful
to
come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You
God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this.
I'm not
you're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war,
you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. It's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once?
A lot of times.
No, in this
even
entire
today,
meeting, you said thank you.
Even today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
So, as you can see behind me, the Ukrainian propaganda networks are gathering the crowd around them to make it look like they have a big crowd of supporters out here. They don't actually have a huge crowd of supporters, but Ukrainian television is just basically propaganda. They're huddling a bunch of people around the camera to give the impression there's a bunch of Ukrainians out here. There's not. In fact, there's a man here who disagrees with them, who's giving them the business. It's kind of amazing. The Ukrainian television is just blatantly propaganda. I mean, they're just huddled around the reporter. It's completely fake.
Then too, how come you ain't over there in Ukraine, but you over here where it's safe? So you won't go over there and do that, talk all that talk, but you'll come to America and do that. So why don't you go over to Ukraine and make it better? You're scared to do that. Man, hey dude, take that energy somewhere else. This is America, man. You can't tell me what to do. I live here. How you think you're going to tell me what to do? How long you been here? Nobody I want to hear it. I got the right to say it, whether you want to hear it or not. Okay, so go on, man. Go ahead on, dude. You barking up the right tree. I'm not barking. You barking up the right tree. You're barking up the right tree. I got to tell. I can protest. I'm protesting against Ukraine because I think it's time to put America first. That's what I think. I think all this money we sending to Ukraine, we need to put that to some of the needs of Americans.
Yep.
That's what we need to do. Because we done gave them over $200 billion. How much more do they need?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. Over $200 billion, and a lot of that ain't even accounted for. How much more can we give Ukraine? Okay? I mean, seriously. So you know, y'all coming out here talking about stand with America.
That's right.
All right? Get the police officers and the teachers a raise.
Yeah, that's right. Okay?
Help the people down there from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina that's still suffering. Why don't you send some money to them? You know, you got Ukrainians getting Social Security. We paying pensions in Ukraine. We paying Social Security benefits to Ukrainians that they didn't even earn. And Americans are suffering. Something wrong with that picture, man.
Donald Trump ran for office on a platform that he would end the Ukraine war, and he didn't care about who won, but rather he would bring the killing to an end. And now we are seeing a historic moment inside the White House. J.D. Vance and President Donald Trump are laying the law down to Zelensky, calling out his ungrateful behavior. Donald Trump accused him with playing with the lives of millions of people and escalating toward World War III. This is really unprecedented. We are seeing a dramatic shift. Zelensky could do no wrong as far as Biden and the Democrats were concerned. He was welcomed to Congress. They rolled out the red carpet for him. But now it looks like the Ukraine scam is coming to an end. Billions and billions of American taxpayer dollars have been pumped into prolonging this war that never should have happened. And it looks like that is changing with the new administration. This is a very, very big day. I am really glad to be outside in front of the White House as this is happening. I did not expect this.
Now, so yeah, that was my report on basically what I saw out in front of the White House yesterday. Now, that African-American man. I have reached out to him, and it looks like on Monday, I will be doing an interview with him for this YouTube channel, and we're going to just let him speak his mind. I was able to find him on Twitter, and I reached out to him, so we'll see what he has to say. I am set up to interview him on Monday. Could be an interesting conversation. We shall see how it goes. It was shout out to John McCarthy, who suggested that I do that. I don't know why that didn't occur to me, but for some reason, with everything I got going on, I didn't think to do that. But, the guy was on Jimmy Dore. They showed his clip and people tagged him, and, he's not that hard to find. So he'll be coming on the channel, it looks like, on Monday. So keep an eye out for that. I was actually able to just set that up tonight, so fingers crossed that goes well. There's been times before where, someone's going to come on, they don't come on or whatever, but it looks like we're set to have him on Monday. So it's going to be interesting. I know nothing about the man at all, honestly. It looks like he did tours of the Washington, D.C. area about Black history. That's kind of his background. He sounds kind of like he might be a Trump supporter, but I don't know. That's not for sure. He doesn't agree with sending more money to Ukraine. That's for sure. But other than that, I don't quite know much about him. He goes by Truth Conductor. And he apparently did tours of Washington, D.C. About African-American history at one point. He was like a tour guide. So we'll see. We'll just get to know him, right? And he apparently goes out to the White House a lot with his sound system to speak his mind about politics. Sounds like an interesting person, and I'm looking forward to talking to him. But yeah, we've already got one super chat for the second half from Gabby, and we're just going to jump right into it. So tonight we've got a slideshow. Tonight's slideshow: why a government of action and the end of liberalism. Now, for a long time, folks, the slogan that we have used for the Center for Political Innovation is we need a government of action to fight for working families. And that has been the slogan that we've used for quite some time. And in the past, I've had people who say, well, that just sounds like random words. I can assure you these are not random words. First of all, why do I say a government of action to fight for working families? Well, that's because in the 1990s, the labor unions did polls, and they discovered that if you wanted to build up public support for things like higher wages and healthcare benefits and jobs, etc., one of the ways to do that was to refer to those who would benefit not as working people or the working class, but as working families, because family gives people a feeling of community. And if you think of a working family, you think of parents that are going out and working hard to pay their bills. You think of community coming together. Americans respond far more positively to talk of working families than they do of talk of workers or the working class. In America, everyone thinks they're in the middle class. No one thinks that they're part of the quote unquote working class. But when you say working families, people feel good about that. So basic marketing research by the labor union said, let's talk about working families. Here in New York State, they have the Working Families Party, which is like another form of the Democratic Party that has a ballot line. They have the Working Families Conference that is sponsored by the labor unions. Well, the communist groups at the time, they all denounced that because they said the term working families was somehow anti-LGBT. And that right there shows you how dumb, and absurd communist groups can be, because everybody can tell that working families is a far more marketable and persuasive term than just working class. And so when I was thinking of what slogan would I like for the movement I'm trying to build with the Center for Political Innovation, I said, we're going to talk about working families. But why did I call for a government of action? Why that? What does that even mean? A government of action? Well, that's what we're going to get into tonight, because government of action is a repudiation of liberalism, and not liberals in the sense of the Democrats and Republicans. Liberalism, the ideology that defines and drives the so-called West. And that is what we're going to talk about tonight. Why we are for a government of action and the end of liberalism. So let's first get into what is liberalism. Liberalism is a political and philosophical worldview that celebrates individualism above all else. Liberalism is a rejection of collectivism. Liberalism is all about the individual, individual rights. It is the government has no right to tell you what to do. You have no obligation to anybody else. Economic liberalism is the free market and capitalism. Social liberalism is your ability to just do whatever you feel like doing, not having any community obligation. The liberal government system is the democratic republic, and the liberal economic system is capitalism or the free market. The democratic republic is a government of elected individuals, and those elected individuals, they basically don't have the ability to interfere with your life. You have freedom of religion, which is a good thing. Freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of, all these things are good things. I'm totally all for freedom. And capitalism, or the free market, is the idea that the economy takes care of itself, that the state shouldn't intervene in the economy, etc. And this is the liberal worldview. Conservatives and Republicans in America emphasize market and economic liberalism. They believe in the free market. Democrats and the so-called liberals in American politics, they emphasize the social part of this. Your right to use drugs, your right to freedom of speech, your right to just do whatever you want to do and live according to your own rules or whatever. Liberalism is the celebration of the individual above all else, and it is the ideology upon which the so-called West, the collective West, the NATO countries, the Atlanticist countries, the colonial countries, the colonizers, the colonial powers were established. And we're going to talk about it. Liberalism, it's based on a logical fallacy. It views freedom as an eternal value disconnected from any conditions or state of development. All right? And that's the first problem with liberalism. It makes it sound like everyone was just evil until like the 1400s in Europe. And then John Locke came along and said, everyone should have the right to life, liberty, and property. And people were like, well, they should. It doesn't take into account that the reason nobody talked about freedom of speech or freedom of religion or freedom of the press or life, liberty, and property until like the 1400s in Europe was because there had not yet been the level of economic development to facilitate those rights. People were not evil in ancient Greece and Rome, and that's why they didn't have freedom. People were not evil in medieval times, and that's why they didn't have freedom. People were not evil in the Dark Ages. There had never been a level of economic development that could allow for and facilitate the level of freedom that emerged in Western societies in the 1400s, 1500s, etc. And that's a really, really important thing to understand because the United States talks about freedom in the complete abstract. America is a good country because we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of religion, etc. And all these other countries that don't have it, well, they're just bad, and because they don't have it. And so we just need to show them the way to be good. It doesn't take into account that different countries are in different circumstances, that freedom in any society is rooted in the level of development and the conditions of that society. And that the less developed a society is, the more authoritarian it's going to be. The more developed, the more stable, then the more you're going to have freedom. And freedom is a good thing, but it doesn't exist in the abstract. And that is one of the biggest flaws in liberalism. Liberalism views freedom as an eternal value. The people living in ancient Egypt should have had the exact same level of freedom that you and I have. And the fact that they didn't, that meant the Pharaoh was evil and all of that. Well, that's fallacious. Freedom is rooted in development, right? The economic base of society. We've gone from hunter-gatherer civilization to slavery to feudalism, and with the dawn of capitalism, we started to see the beginning of civil liberties. And the feudal system had one economic form. The ancient slave systems had their economic form. The majority of human civilization was hunter-gatherer civilization, where people lived in tribes, and each of those forms has had a different political model. And as we get more development, the individual has more room to be themselves and think as they want and say what they want, etc. Freedom is not an eternal value. It's rooted in development. The second flaw in liberalism is that liberalism is always propped up by illiberalism. There is no more hypocritical ideology than liberalism, right? And I mean, our great American history is a great example of that, right? At the time that our country was being established, our leaders couldn't talk. They were espousing the liberal ideology like you wouldn't believe. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, our God-given rights and freedom. And they had slaves. Well, how does that work? Well, that's liberalism. There's always something like that going on. During the Cold War, the argument of the United States was that we have freedom. We're the great societies that have freedom. And those communists, they want to take your freedom away. And we're fighting for your freedom while they backed all kinds of brutal authoritarian dictators like Park Chung-hee in South Korea, like Pinochet in Chile, like the dictatorship in Indonesia. I mean, like Marcos in the Philippines. There were all kinds of brutal dictators who were on our side at the same time that our whole argument for why we were better than the communists is we have freedom. And it is always the case. Liberalism could not exist without illiberalism. There's always authoritarianism and repression and people being violated of their rights. At the same time, you have a liberal society saying, look at us, we're so great because we have our rights. And even some of the people that we can really admire. I admire, for example, Oliver Cromwell, because Oliver Cromwell broke apart feudalism in Britain, cut off the head of the King of England, was fighting for, freedom of religion and the right of people to read the Bible for themselves. But at the same time, you can't pretend that Oliver Cromwell, yes, he may have been a champion of the rights of English people, and their freedom to some degree or other. But at the same time, he wasn't, for the Irish people, and he committed genocide against the Irish people for being Catholic. You can think about Napoleon, right? Napoleon, when he was marching the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe, right? He said he was the revolution in boots. He was marching the French Revolution across Europe, and the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, the new order, meritocracy. But then what was he doing in Haiti? And where he was a colonizer and a brutal oppressor of the Haitian people, and in the islands that were the colonies of France, where they had slavery of African people, and they brutally exterminated the indigenous people. And there's just example after example of this. Liberalism is always propped up by illiberalism, and it's not just in the past; it's currently. For example, great example, Zelensky. We are told that, the reason we must support Ukraine is a democracy, and, Russia, which is supposed to be not a democracy, an authoritarian regime, is attacking this democracy. Well, folks, I was in Russia just last March, just a year ago. I was in Russia to observe their election, which they had in line with their constitution. They haven't had an election in Ukraine. But why is Ukraine a democracy? Well, they're in the middle of a war, Caleb. They can't just have an election in the middle of a war. Oh, so does that mean the conditions that countries are in determines how much democracy and freedom they have? So you're saying that Ukraine being in the middle of a war means that they have less democratic process and freedom. So that would mean that liberalism is not an eternal value. Freedom is not an eternal value. A country can be in conditions where it doesn't have that, right? And, and when I was in Russia, I met opposition candidates from the Liberal Democratic Party, from the Communist Party. All the opposition parties in Ukraine have been outlawed. Well, they say, but Caleb, they're in the middle of a war. Of course they're going to so conditions do matter. Ukraine is a very illiberal society. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of association. They haven't had an election. They don't even have freedom of religion. They've brutally suppressed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So, that's the exception. It's like, well, sure, we're for freedom, and that's why we're so good, but we ought to make an exception for Ukraine because they're against Russia, and Russia's just so bad, blah, 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 blah. Right? And that there's just many examples of how, first of all, they make freedom an abstract value. They don't take into account the conditions or historical development. And number two, there's always a hypocrisy to it. Liberalism is never true to its principles. Liberalism is they're at the same time, liberal societies, they're always propping up brutal dictatorships. They're always outlawing dissidents and throwing them in jail. They're always practicing slavery. They're always, Guantanamo Bay. Liberal societies are never actually practicing what they preach. And they aren't, and they can't, because liberalism is a facade, right? As long as some people own and control the means of production and others do not, there is going to be different levels of power. And those who own and control the means of production are going to make sure that they keep their hold over them. So if people look like they might be conspiring against the interests of those who own and control the means of production, they're going to be suppressed. And that liberalism has never been true to its principles. It has always been something they espouse and do not practice. And it also doesn't acknowledge that freedom in any society is related to historical conditions, etc. So that's the flaw in the liberal worldview. But let's continue. So where does liberalism come from? Liberalism arose, the very beginning of liberalism was in ancient Greece and ultimately Rome was the first real expression of liberalism. But we saw it in Athens, Greece. In Greece, you had city-states. And these city-states had navies, and they controlled trade routes. Greece is very much an ocean-based Mediterranean society. And these city-states were fighting with each other. And they discovered that if you wanted to build an empire for your city-state, right, if Athens wanted to control trade routes and all of that, a way to get people motivated to do it was to have an elected government rather than simply a king. Why? Because the king, if it's a king, he makes all the decisions. And so if people go out and fight and loot and plunder, and they get a bunch of slaves and they get a bunch of treasure, and they bring it back, and then the king says, well, I'm the king, it's all mine. Thanks for fighting for me, guys. Well, if people realize that, they don't want to fight. But if you have a Senate where every landowning family gets a vote, if you have elections where you have representatives who make that decision, then people are much more invested in the process of building an empire. And liberalism was always tied in with building an empire. As the Athenians wanted to build an empire, they realized that if they wanted to motivate everyone to go out and fight and build the empire, they needed to give all the landowners, let me emphasize this, the landowners the vote. Athens, Greece, we're told, was the cradle of democracy. 90% of the people in Athens didn't get to vote on anything. They were slaves. But among the landowners, the slave owners, among those who owned the land and owned the slaves, they realized that instead of having one guy be the king who got to make all the decisions, if all the slave owners got some representation in how the loot was divided up, they'd all be motivated to go out and plunder. And ancient Rome continued that. In Rome, the civilization that emerged on the Italian peninsula as Greece was in decline, but the other side of the Mediterranean, you have Rome on the Italian peninsula. They very much put that into practice. And the Roman Republic, the reason that they had a hereditary Senate where every old landowning family got a vote, it was hereditary, and they had a national assembly where all the landowners got to elect representatives. That was because it made it much more effective to go out and build an empire. Going out and building an empire requires motivating everybody to get involved in the process. And so you need to have a system where everybody gets a say in how the loot is divided up. Now, and in order, if you're going to have that, you have to ensure that if you have a debate about how you're going to divide up the loot and somebody disagrees with somebody, they don't get thrown in jail for doing so. So you have to have some level of free speech if you're going to have elections. You have to have some level of open debate. These were societies that were what you call polytheistic. And so you had different gods that people would import. So you had some level of freedom of religion. And ancient Greece and ancient Rome were the very beginnings of liberalism. But that liberalism only applied to the landowners. The landowners got to vote, and And in ancient Greece, many of these societies did not maintain their liberalism. Sparta was not a liberal society. Athens was a liberal society. In ancient Greece, they even had a theory, like a cycle. They argued that a city-state goes through a cycle. That first they are a monarchy, which is you have a good king who rules for the behalf of the nation. But then the king becomes corrupt, and then it degenerates from monarchy to tyranny. And so as a result of tyranny, the tyrant is overthrown, and you have an oligarchy, which is a benevolent elite, a group of wealthy or powerful people who rule for the good of the nation. But then the oligarchy deteriorates into a plutocracy of the corrupt rich. And so then the plutocracy is overthrown by the republic, which is the elected government. The corrupt rich are overthrown by an elected government called a republic. But then the republic deteriorates into mob rule and chaos, which is called democracy. And out of the democracy then emerges the monarchy, the good king, and it's a cycle that societies go through. And that, the Greek city-states were kind of the prototype of Atlantis' civilization, where among the slave-owning class, people had rights and there were elected governments. And then ancient Rome, the Roman Republic, very much, it lasted a lot longer. And the Roman Republic, it was a quite effective version of this, where they had the hereditary Senate and they had the National Assembly, kind of like we have the Senate and the House of Representatives. They had the Senate, which was in ancient Rome, it was hereditary, kind of like the House of Lords in Britain. And then they had the House of, they had what was called the National Assembly, which in America we have the House of Representatives. In Britain, they have the House of Commons. And they had like a bicameral system, and it was the Republic, the Roman Republic. Well, what happened? The Roman Republic gave birth to Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar was a populist who became a champion of the proletariat, the non-landowning people. And Rome was full of people who were neither slaves nor masters, but wage workers, skilled, artisans, plumbers, blacksmiths, carpenters, etc. And Julius Caesar, who was from the landowning class, was a general, got to be very powerful because he aligned himself with the proletarians, and he came up with a scheme to grant citizenship to other cities throughout the empire and make the empire multipolar, not all centered around Rome. And as a result of that, the Roman elite said, we can't have any more of this, and so they stabbed him to death. And from then on, Rome became, a monarchy once again, or an empire. They had an emperor who they believed to be a god man on earth. They murdered Julius Caesar for being a champion of the proletarians, the populists. But, the fall, and Rome was an empire or a monarchy until it fell. And the fall of Rome was quite a devastating blow to European civilization. It took Europe 1,100 years to get back to the population level it had had. And actually, it was around the time that the United States of America was being formed that you had the European population levels returning to what they had been at the time of the Roman Empire. The most popular book, this is fascinating. There weren't many books back in the time of the American Revolution. The printing press was a very new thing, etc. But the most popular book was Edward Gibbon's book, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Or I think it's called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was this guy, Edward Gibbon, who was doing all this research about the fall of the Roman Empire. And if you go to the libraries of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, they all have copies of the 8 volumes of Edward Gibbon's Rise or Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And they're all studying, why did the Roman Empire fall? And when they were designing Washington, D.C., the streets of Washington, D.C. are very much modeled on the streets of Rome. And the buildings, you look at the White House, you look at the U.S. Capitol, it's modeled on these ancient Roman buildings. They have the pillars, etc. And that many of the cities in upstate New York and in New England, and they're very much named after Roman generals like Syracuse, for example. And that the founders of the United States very much knew that they were doing the Roman Empire again. They very much understood that we're kind of doing what no one has really tried to do since the time of the Romans, which is have an elected government and have a democracy. And they understood that democracy that they were building was very fragile. And they also understood, which is that there was a reason for that, which is that in order to generate great wealth and have an empire, you need people involved. Now, originally, if you read the Constitution of the United States, originally, only those who owned property could vote. And that's how it was in Britain. That's how it was in many of the emerging liberal societies. As they were emerging, they only gave the vote to those who owned property. Now, why does that make any sense? The argument was those who own property are, quote, invested in the nation, meaning they will financially benefit from building the empire, right? Because if you don't own any property, you're not going to get rich from making the land more prosperous. However, if you are, a landowner and the value of the land increases and the wealth of the nation increases, you're going to get wealthier. And so liberalism arose as a mechanism for building a colonial or an imperial society. And that many people have pointed out, you could not have had what they call the bourgeois revolution or the rise of capitalism in Europe without colonialism first. If Christopher Columbus and the Spanish monarchy had not started exploring and rounding the Cape, etc. If 1492, Columbus hadn't sailed the ocean blue, if the British weren't, colonizing the New World, it was colonialism that laid the basis for enough wealth to be generated in the Western countries that they could overthrow feudalism and establish the capitalist economic mode of production, and from there start building a quote-unquote liberal society. And what was colonialism? Was colonialism freedom? Absolutely not. Wasn't freedom for the Native Americans. Wasn't freedom for the millions of Africans killed in the transcontinental slave trade, the transatlantic route, the Middle Passage of millions of Africans dragged from their homes and taken to the United States and to the Caribbean to be worked to death. It was if there hadn't been all this brutal authoritarian illiberalism, you would never have had enough wealth generated in America and Britain and France and Germany and Italy to have enough wealth to overthrow feudalism and talk about establishing a liberal society. And this was the primitive accumulation. And that's, an important point. There's a book called Capital, written by Karl Marx. And a lot of people don't get through the book because the opening of Capital is quite dull. So I'll give you a cheat code for this book, Capital. Skip to chapter 8, right? Chapter 8, is it chapter 8 or part 8, is called Primitive Accumulation. And you read that, and that's much more interesting. It's not, a dull section about where is value determined and how is value created. It's very, very much a history of capitalism. And it talks about how, when they broke apart the feudal commons, section 8, part 8. When they broke apart the feudal commons, part 8, so-called primitive accumulation. When they broke apart the feudal commons, there were all of a sudden peasants. Peasants had just lived on the land, right? And if you were on this land, you were a peasant. Well, the feudal commons, all of a sudden, there were all these people that had to pay rent and they had to be wage workers. And so they started executing homeless people. There were all the death penalty was implemented for vagrancy. If you were a vagabond or a vagrant, they gave you the death penalty, and they hung thousands of people just for being homeless as part of the process of creating capitalism. And that all across Europe, when they converted the land of Europe into private property for owners who were trying to make profit from the land, not feudal commons owned by medieval lords, but rather property, there was a whole process of killing millions of people. And then they seized Africa, and they seized the Americas and slavery, etc. And liberalism came into the world dripping with blood. And the liberalism was basically a mechanism for motivating the landowning class to go out and build an empire and plunder, right? And all of this is important because we're bursting the myths of liberal society, right? We're all told that that these freedoms are eternal and that the intention is morality and all of this. No. Okay. And I guess I just have to be blatantly, there's no way to beat around this. Liberalism has killed more people than any other ideology in history. Okay. And this is important because people forget this, right? We're always given a body count for communism. Communism killed a gabillion people. And then fascism too, right? Fascism, the fascist system, Hitler and Mussolini and all of that, we're always given body counts for them. No one would have ever thought about communism or fascism if it hadn't been for the fact that liberalism was killing people on a massive scale. And no one ever wants to give a body count for liberalism. But liberalism is by far the most murderous system that has ever existed. Slavery, the transcontinental slave trade, the genocide of the Native Americans, the colonialism and the colonization of Africa. The British Empire created man-made famines all over the world. At one point, they killed 15% of the people living in Ireland. They killed millions of people in India by, destroying their economy and burning the looms. China, right? China, when they were emerging as a country in the 1800s, they didn't want to be part of the British and their free trade system. So they tried to enact economic regulations and protections to make sure that the British couldn't, dominate their economy. And one of the regulations was you can't bring opium into our country, no opium. And so the British waged 2 opium wars to force China to accept free trade and to accept the domination of British multinational corporations, the 2 opium wars. And the opium wars were devastating. And the result was destroying the Chinese economy, bringing opium into the country, addicting all kinds of people to drugs, setting back their ability to develop, creating a situation where they had to import all their goods from Western countries. Hong Kong was seized by the British Empire and became a British protectorate. Shanghai had chunks of it that were seized by the French. It was the century of humiliation for China. The Chinese government estimates that roughly 100 million people died as a result of the century of humiliation. And, why is it there's so many Irish Americans? That's because of land seizures. The British, the Whig Party, which was the more free market party in Britain, forced free trade onto Ireland. And they created a famine. All kinds of Irish people had their property taken away, their farms. They were kicked out of their farms, and big Protestant and British landowners seized their land and forced them out, and they were forced to come to the United States. And that wasn't just back then. That's right up to today. Libya used to be the most prosperous country on the African continent, and the liberal countries, the NATO powers, the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, bombed and destroyed it. And now Libya is devastated, and there's open air slave markets in Libya. Iraq was a relatively stable country in the Middle East, and look how it's been ever since the liberal Western powers, led by the United States, invaded it and overthrew it based on lies about weapons of mass destruction. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they brought liberalism into the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was a puppet of the West, and he imposed radical free market policies on the former Soviet Union, and their population decreased by 10%. 1 in 10 people either died or left the country. U.S. economist Andre Gunder Frank called it economic genocide. The sex trafficking rate was massive. The suicide rate was massive. Deaths from drug addiction were massive. It was just the economic devastation. No system in history has ever killed anywhere near as many as liberalism has killed. And this is really, really important because people just forget this. It's like it doesn't count if the liberalism do it, right? And it's like, well, they say, well, slavery is not really freedom. So therefore, all the hundreds of millions killed in slavery and the Middle Passage and all that, that's not killed by liberalism because it's not freedom. Well, the people doing it were espousing liberal ideas. It was Thomas Jefferson who was owning those slaves. It was the founders of the United States that were doing it. It was the British Empire that was facilitating the slave trade very much. So you can say, oh, well, it wasn't real liberalism, but it was still doing it. Right. And the wars of conquest, we always hear about the Spanish-American War. You know, after the Spanish-American War, you had the Philippine War, the U.S.-Philippine War, the Philippine-American War, where the Filipino people were fighting for their independence from the United States, and the USA, they sent the Marines, and there were hundreds of thousands, 500,000 Filipinos that were killed in the Philippine-American War and the lead up to World War I. And the colonization of Africa. I mean, you go down the line, country after country, nation after nation. Liberalism has killed millions of people, and the main driving force behind liberalism is the British Empire. The United States, you know, obviously is a liberal country that was formed, and it was originally part of the British Empire, established its independence. But the British Empire, they were the pioneers of liberalism, and they published the works of Adam Smith, the Scottish economist who wrote about the wealth of nations and the concept of free trade. And liberalism as a system was brought into the world by British bankers and the London Stock Exchange that were the main fighting force. The British, with their global sea-based empire that was espousing the ideals of, you know, life, liberty, and property, and the rights of man and free trade, etc. That system, that Atlanticist system, which America is part of, France, Germany, Italy, they're part of it. That system, liberalism, the collective West, have killed more than, you know, even if every allegation that they made about Stalin was true, it wouldn't hold a candle to what liberalism has killed. And this is hard for a lot of people to stomach. It really is. And we forget it. It's like somehow it doesn't count, right? If liberalism kills these people, if the British commit genocide in India, well, liberalism didn't kill them. The big mean British people did. Well, they were espousing liberalism, and they were doing it to prop up their liberal free market system. So, China, you go down the line, all over the world, liberalism has killed millions of people, wars of conquest. Now, liberalism has a built-in problem. You're right ahead of me. It has a built-in problem, which is that it's the capitalist system, or the economic liberalism, has a built-in problem, which is the only system where abundance creates poverty, where people can be impoverished because too much wealth has been created. That has never existed before, right? Poverty and economic destitution created by abundance. And that is something that is unique to the capitalist free market system. And I'm actually going to put on this clip that I have, one of my better clips, where I explain that when you have the means of production, the centers of economic power operating privately by owners who are trying to maximize profits, you have this unique problem of the more technology advances and the more wealth that is created, you have economic crises created by abundance. People become homeless because there are too many houses. People become hungry because there's too much food. It's crazy.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. Do you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America, so I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I am going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
I very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right, if you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply irrational nature of the capitalist system.
So we have a situation, as you show there, where they're always creating more products than they are paying out wages in the process of production. So the wages paid out in the process of production are never enough to buy back the product. And this problem is always getting worse because technology is always increasing. And the more efficient production becomes, the less wages that are paid out, and the bigger this problem is. And so they're constantly needing to seize new markets through which they can dump the excess products, right? You constantly need a new group of people to buy your products because the more products you create, the less people there is to buy them. You know, the wages paid out are never enough. So capitalism moves into its imperialist stage where they're seizing parts of the world as captive markets. And I've used many examples of what imperialism is. Imperialism is the fact that, Mexico used to have its own farming sector. And then the United States with NAFTA imposed free trade on them, put all the Mexican farmers out of business, and now Mexico buys its food from American agribusiness corporations. Haiti used to have its own farming sector, and Haiti now buys and imports its food from American corporations. And that you're constantly looking for new markets, people to buy your products, because you're always having more products than you are having wages paid out, and that there's a frequent problem of overproduction, which is people become hungry because there is too much food. People become homeless because there are too many houses. And that the more efficient production becomes and the more efficient they make the means of production, the bigger the problem you have. And I talk about self-driving cars, which should be a great thing, but it would lead to massive unemployment and hunger in the United States. This is the irrational nature. So capitalism moves into its imperialist stage because they need to seize new markets through which they can dump their products on, etc. Now, in the 1800s, as the liberal system is continuing to experience all these great economic turmoils and economic problems, and they're having to seize new markets in order to stabilize the economy, etc. That's when you get the rise of, it was John D. Rockefeller in the United States, the owner of Standard Oil Company. He went to Britain and he made friends with a lot of the people in the Round Table Group, which was started by Cecil Rhodes, the guy who colonized Africa. Rhodesia was named after him. That's what Zimbabwe was called before it won its independence. And they called themselves Neo-Malthusians. Malthusianism was an economic school of thought that argued that the population always rises quicker than the food supply, and that the French Revolution had been caused by, quote unquote, overpopulation. Well, in the 1800s, the Rockefeller family and the Rhodes, Round Table Group, and a lot of the wealthy British people, they argued that the problems of the capitalist system in the West were caused by overpopulation. And they began thinking of various schemes that they could develop to reduce the population and reduce consumption in order to stabilize the economy. And they started arguing that you need to degrow the economy. You need to have wars to drive down the population. You need to, promote birth control everywhere and have people, not have children. We've got to reduce the population because the problem is overpopulation. That's what they were arguing. The problems of imperialism and the capitalist, liberal system are caused by overpopulation. And that became a popular view among the ultra rich and among the British Empire and among the Rockefeller family, etc. So, we have the colonial wars. They're dividing, they're seizing sections of Africa, they're seizing sections of Asia, and they're fighting with each other. And all of that leads to World War I. And World War I was the war to end all wars. And it was the Great War between the British imperialists and the French imperialists, and eventually the American imperialists against the German and the Austrian imperialists. And they were fighting over colonies, right? The Germans had chunks of Africa that they wanted. They had chunks of China that they wanted, and they wanted to build a global empire. And the Austrians and the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, they all had sections of the world they wanted, but they were up against the British and the Americans and the French. And so they had a war in which 20 million people died in World War I. And it was a war to redivide the world. It was a war between the colonial powers, or the imperialists, were fighting over who got big chunks of the world. And Germany was stripped of its colonies at the end of the First World War, and Austria was stripped of its colonies, and Turkey was stripped of its colonies. And the British and Americans and French, they divided up the rest of the world, and they drew the map of the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, is how the maps of the Middle East were designed, right? The Arab people are one nation, but the reason you have Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Syria is because they made an agreement among themselves. The Americans and the British and the French, they drew the borders for what the Middle East would be, and they picked certain kings to rule certain areas. And Syria was under the control of the French, and Iraq had a king that was picked by the British, and the British picked the Saudis to rule Saudi Arabia. and that this is how the maps of the Middle East were drawn up. And Africa was carved up in a similar way. Do you think that those borders in Africa were drawn up just because, the people in Nigeria have always been different than the people of Gabon and the people of Namibia? I mean, no, those borders were drawn up by colonizers. And these countries, Angola was run by the Portuguese. And South Africa was under the domination of the British, and Zimbabwe, which was called at that time Rhodesia after a British guy named Cecil Rhodes, those borders were drawn up by the colonizers, and they carved up the world. And World War I was a big, giant war in which 20 million people, most of whom were white European people, died in order to carve up the world. And after World War I, there was a huge economic expansion because there'd been so much destruction. All of Central Europe had been destroyed. All of France, all of Germany had all been destroyed. Belgium had been destroyed. And so there was a speed up of production. And the United States had not had fighting on U.S. territory, on U.S. soil. So the United States was at the center of that. And so the United States experienced what they called the Roaring '20s, where the economy was doing well. And the United States had not lost its industrial capacity. So people were buying things from the United States. Henry Ford, had developed assembly line production and was selling cars to the whole world and radios. And there was a boom in the Roaring '20s. And the slogan that they used in the 1920s is they said, Ford has overtaken Marx. Because they said Marx said capitalism is inefficient, but Henry Ford has developed this really, really efficient form of capitalism where he pays the workers a significantly higher wage, and that enables them to buy the products. And that Henry Ford has invented this new ultra efficient form of capitalism that does not have the problems that Karl Marx pointed to. Well, that obviously didn't work out. And in the 1930s, you had a long-term economic crisis, which was that all the assembly line production and all the very, very efficient methods for churning out products led to a big crisis of overproduction and all that stuff about, people not being able to buy back the products and overproduction. You had an economic crisis. But what made the Great Depression different than in the past was usually these economic crises ended in 1 or 2 years. They'd have a panic, they called it. The stock market would go down and people would be unemployed and starving. But after a year or two, we'd be back up and running again. That didn't happen in the Great Depression because the technological leaps of Henry Ford and the technological leaps that came after World War I were so big that the capitalist economy couldn't really resuscitate itself. And throughout the entire 1930s, they were still in the Great Depression. And it didn't get better. And it didn't get better. However, in the Soviet Union, you had a country that had broken out of capitalism and imperialism. And they had 5-year economic plans. And they were booming economically. And they were raising their people up out of poverty. And the Soviet Union was rapidly expanding its economy and electrifying and industrializing. And a lot of engineers and scientists from the Western countries were going to the Soviet Union and studying. And the Soviet Union was having a great economic expansion. The Koch brothers, their father, Fred Koch, was a chemist who worked with oil. And he went to the Soviet Union and he helped Stalin set up the oil industry. And General Electric helped set up, power plants in the Soviet Union, and that there was all kinds of business with the Western imperialists and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was where the growth was happening. The rest of the world was stagnating. And in the Soviet Union, you had economic expansion. Well, in the Western countries, of course, a lot of people were unemployed and hungry, and the Soviet Union was booming. And a lot of intellectuals and scientists and others were going to the Soviet Union and seeing how great it was. And the Soviet Union was aligned with communist parties that built labor unions and built protest movements of the unemployed. So a lot of people in the Western countries started becoming communists because they said, hey, look, we're having this long-term economic crisis, and the communists, Marx, they explain this is the problem of overproduction. And so we're going to have a communist revolution. And in France and in Germany in particular, millions of people joined the Communist Party. In America, the Communist Party was very big and very strong and influential. You had a rise in communist influence, and millions of people started becoming communists. And then, the main people that were threatened by communists were factory owners, because communists built labor unions of people who worked in factories. And factory owners, they did not want communism because that would lead to their property being nationalized. It would lead to, the state seizing the means of production. And those communists were organizing unions of the factory workers that were forcing them to sign contracts and pay higher wages and cutting into their profits. So among the industrialists, you had another illiberal movement formed called fascism. And fascism promised to build a military state that would crush the communists and crush the labor unions as a mechanism for stabilizing the economy. So as the liberal system is, failing in the West, millions of working class people are becoming communists. And among middle-class people, shopkeepers and factory owners, and among the rich and powerful, you have fascism arising. So two illiberal movements are arising. Nobody would have ever become a communist, and nobody ever would have become a fascist if liberalism worked. And let me repeat this, right? Because a lot of people don't get this. They think liberalism, it's fine. It's only fascism and communism that have problems. Nobody would have ever thought about either of those things if it hadn't been for the failure of liberalism, right? The liberal system, which is individualism above all else, would never have been would never have been, there wouldn't have been anyone opposing it if there hadn't been failure of liberalism. And communism offered class solidarity, right? The solidarity with your class, the working class. Fascism offered nationalism, the nation. And they were both collectivist ideologies that were saying you're not an individual. The communists are saying you're part of a class, the working class. The fascists are saying you're part of a nation, etc. But they're both collectivist ideologies, and they both are seeking heavy-handed control over the economy. Communists want a centrally planned economy. Fascists want, a heavy-handed state that imposes, breaks the labor movement and imposes militarism, etc. But both of them want heavy state control because liberalism isn't working. And they're both trying to build mass movements to lay the basis for heavy-handed state control to address the problems of liberalism. All right, next. So obviously that all leads to World War II. World War II happens, and World War II is an epic disaster, hundreds of millions of people killed. The Holocaust, 27 million people die in the Soviet Union, tens of millions of people die in China and in Korea and in Japan, and it's an absolute disaster. So after World War II, you have what's called the Keynesian consensus. That's because of John Maynard Keynes. Here, I'll show a picture of him. John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes is the main British economist. He's not a communist, not a socialist, but he's not into the free market either. And John Maynard Keynes, his thinking is, he says, World War II happened, fascism and communism arose because of the fact that that liberalism, that we need the government to spend money. Right? That the capitalist economy, he doesn't call it overproduction. He says the problem is underconsumption. But he says that, there's this problem of underconsumption. So we need the government to spend lots of money. He doesn't care what they spend it on, but you need the government to spend money so we don't have something like the Great Depression again. And John Maynard Keynes, his philosophy is often summarized. They talk about ditch digging, right? Is that the government hires somebody to go and dig a ditch, and then it hires somebody else to go fill the ditch back in. And somebody says, well, that's a waste of our tax money. And John Maynard Keynes says, no, good sir, it is not a waste of our tax money, because the men who are hired to dig the ditch and the men who are hired to fill it in, they go and spend their money, and that gets the economy going again. And that's the Keynesian economic philosophy. The government should spend money in order to make sure that nothing like World War II ever happens again, the Great Depression, communism, fascism. To prevent both of those things, we just have to have the government constantly spending money. And that was what they called the Keynesian consensus. And after World War II, in the West, it was understood, okay, we obviously don't need communism, we don't need fascism, but we got to have the money, the government spend lots of money. And that's what happened. And in America, we had the military industrial complex, which is after World War II, the US government just started buying military equipment and spending huge amounts of money on the military. And in Britain, you had the rise of the welfare state and national health care service created. And you had all kinds of government employment schemes. In the United States, we built a university system. And we built, a modern highway system. And this was the government just has to keep spending money in order to stabilize the economy. And they call it the Keynesian consensus, that, it was just absolutely necessary that the government spend money. Doesn't matter what it's on, but in order to offset the irrationality of the capitalist system, the government should spend money. That's Keynesianism, and it wasn't until the 1970s that people started saying, well, maybe we don't need the government to spend money. And it was in the early 70s, you had the rise of people like Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Ayn Rand, Alan Greenspan, who started saying, well, actually, you don't need the government to spend money. The capitalist system is just magical. It just works on its own. You don't need the government to spend money. Now, all the academic economists said no. They said, without the government regulating, you get what's called natural monopolies. Without, antitrust legislation, the economy gets monopolistic stagnation. Without the government pumping money into the economy, you have gluts on the market. That no, you need the government to spend money to stimulate the economy. But there was a layer of people in the 1970s, the Chicago school, the Austrian school, that started becoming popular, that said, no, capitalism is just magic. It doesn't need that. You don't need the government to spend money. And this is flim-flam. And it's not taken seriously by academic economists. It's gobbledygook, but it is just believed. It is like a religion with these people. No, capitalism is just magic. It's just magic. And, and it's like you have to ask these people, why did World War II happen? And why did communism become popular? And why did fascism arise? And what was the Great Depression? Oh, all of that was because of government. If the government had just not been there and had just stayed out of it, none of that would have ever happened. I mean, it's like they live in an alternate reality. But what's really going on is, why are these people becoming popular? Right? Or is everyone just forgetting it? No, it's that this communism is becoming weaker. And especially in the 1980s and 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, part of the reason that the welfare state had been created, and part of the reason that the Keynesian consensus had been created, was because there was a feeling that communism was the alternative and that you had to hold off communism. Well, communism was getting weaker and the Soviet Union had fallen and all of that. So there wasn't fear of communism any longer. And so neoliberalism was brought in. And largely during the Cold War, while the West was preaching freedom, economic free markets, and freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc., there had been various authoritarian military regimes they had propped up in order to fight off communism. And, Marcos in the Philippines was a great example. Park Chung-hee in South Korea. In Indonesia, you had, I think, was it Suharto? And you had, in many Latin American countries, you had, Rios Montt in Guatemala, and you had Pinochet in Chile. You had all these authoritarian strongmen. And the way those guys were able to stay in power, nobody's going to tolerate a dictator unless he's handing out the goods. And this is just the truth. People generally are not willing to tolerate a dictator unless the dictator is making their living standard go up. And the way that these dictators were able to stay in power in South America was that, they killed all the Native American people. And if anyone was talking about being a socialist or a communist, they got dragged away in the middle of the night and killed. But the dictator, with the military, all kinds of people had very easy jobs where they were in the military and they could just sit in an office and they got paid a really high wage. Or, the military would build new highways in the country, or the military would arrange for a factory to be built somewhere. The dictator was obsessed with economic growth, because if people weren't seeing their living standard go up, they weren't going to tolerate the dictatorship. Trujillo in the Dominican Republic was like this, and that the dictators were awful, and they were especially awful to darker-skinned people in Latin America. They genocided them and killed them in big mass. In South Korea, Park Chung-hee had a concentration camp for homeless children. If there was homeless children, they'd be dragged off the street and they'd be worked to death in a concentration camp. They had no problem murdering and exterminating people they considered to be undesirable. Native Americans, poor people, homeless people, etc. But there had to be a layer of people that were getting paid and were seeing their incomes go up, or they wouldn't tolerate the dictatorship. Well, what happened with neoliberalism was after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. government said, we don't need to tolerate this anymore. We don't need to pay these dictators. We don't need to let these dictators grow their economy any longer. And they started saying, you know what, we can just let these countries be impoverished. So one by one, these dictators started getting overthrown. And George Soros, who had funded like liberal activism against communist governments, he also funded liberal activism against pro-Western dictators, right? And like Marcos in the Philippines, like Pinochet in Chile, and he funded people to go out, and the USA overthrew the various dictators that they'd propped up because they didn't want these dictators to hand out the goods anymore. They wanted liberalism. They wanted an open society, which means the government is not involved in the economy and the economy is looted, but it also means freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So at the same time the USA is overthrowing the communist governments with George Soros, they're also overthrowing the authoritarian regimes that they had propped up in the name of fighting communism and allowed to carry out economic growth to stabilize themselves. And all over the developing world, and even in the Western countries, there's this notion that we can just privatize everything. We can get the government, get the government out of the economy because, the Keynesian consensus is over. We don't, the idea we need the government to spend money, that's not necessary anymore. And, we start seeing radical free market policies being implemented. Now, what was going on at the same time was the computer revolution. And what was the computer revolution? Well, it was government action, right? It started out during World War II. There was a math whiz, a math genius, a math professor, really smart, autistic, weird guy named Alan Turing. And Alan Turing was a math genius. And the British government hired him, and they had him design a decoding machine. And Alan Turing was really, he was really good at, and he developed the decoding machine, which was the first modern computer, and it was the decoding machine he used to crack the codes of the German spies and the German submarines. And Alan Turing's decoder machine was not created by the free market. It was created by the British military. He didn't have a choice. They basically found this math professor and they said, make us a decoding machine. And he didn't have a choice in the matter, and the market didn't incentivize him to do it. The government told him to do it. And after World War II, they covered up that he was able to do that. He ended up, he was gay. He was arrested for being gay. He ended up committing suicide. It's a very sad story. But after that, the USSR and the USA both had decoding machines. And they both started developing modern computers. And then you had Zbigniew Brzezinski, who came along. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the main strategist for the USA during the Cold War, he said that the main way we can defeat the communists is with control of information technology. He wrote a book called Between Two Ages, America Enters the Technotronic Era. And in 1970, he's saying basically, the way we're going to defeat the Soviet Union is with control of information technology. And with TV and with information technology, we will, quote, Americanize the world. We will spread our American liberal values all over the world. So Zbigniew Brzezinski writes this, and then under the direction of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the CIA and the NSA and the Pentagon and all of that start loaning money like crazy to build Silicon Valley. And Apple and IBM and Microsoft and Amazon and all the tech monopolies were created by the government. And because they wanted to control information technology. And they had a treaty. There was a NATO treaty, the Treaty on Multilateral High Technology Controls, that you couldn't give any computer technology to the Soviet Union or any of the communist countries. And so basically, the West was pioneering and developing computer technology while not making sure that the Soviet Union didn't get any access to it. And the Soviet Union did a pretty good job with computer technology on their own. They developed their own home computer system in the 80s. They just didn't have the resources to mass produce it. Soviet people didn't have home computers in their homes because why would they mass produce that? And they didn't have the resources to really go all in with the computer revolution. But Soviet, computer technology was pretty good. Despite the fact they were cut off from all the Western innovations, the Soviet Union was able to do quite a bit in terms of computer technology. And they invented Sputnik and they had all kinds of technological advances. They just didn't have the ability to mass produce it and bring it to their society because they were on a much lower level of development. They had just built their country up from nothing. The West had been rising for many years. So Silicon Valley emerges in the West, and Silicon Valley, it's changing everything. Computers change everything in the economy. Well, what does that bring us to? The financial meltdown. Because what did I just show you all in that video about how technology leads to fewer and fewer people being hired? And you should go read High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy. You should go read Low Wage Capitalism by Fred Goldstein. You should go read The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary. You have a huge technological leap. What does it lead to? A prolonged crisis of overproduction. And finally, in 2008, as a result of the computer revolution, the U.S. economy crashes. And why does the U.S. economy crash in 2008? It crashes because Americans can't afford to keep buying homes. And Alan Greenspan has pushed Congress to legalize all kinds of lending practices to keep Americans buying homes. But the reality is Americans just can't afford to keep buying homes. Our wages have gone down. Our living standard has gone down. The rate of household debt is astronomical because they've legalized all kinds of credit schemes to keep us spending money we don't have. Americans are just too poor in this economy that has no room for us. In this high-tech, low-wage economy, we can't afford to keep buying all these products that are being produced. And the housing bubble burst, and people in America became homeless because there were too many houses. There were too many houses. And, we couldn't afford to keep buying them. And so in 2008, all kinds of people became homeless and were spending their Christmas living in tents, their Christmas holiday living in tents outside of Nevada. And homeless encampments sprung up across Los Angeles, Skid Row, and all of this because there's too many houses. It's not ironic that so many people are homeless and there's so many empty houses. People are homeless because there are so many houses, and that overproduction with technology, they eliminated so many jobs, and that computer revolution that was created by the government to defeat the Soviet Union creates an economic crisis. So then, after the 2008 financial meltdown, U.S. society is, in a world of hurt. So there starts to be a fight among the elite. And the managerial wing of the ruling class, that's the Malthusian ultra-rich. They want degrowth desperately. And they are putting forward all kinds of very sinister schemes. They are obsessed with overpopulation. And they say the only way we can stabilize, the economy is we have to degrow like you wouldn't believe. And the World Economic Forum, which is the British Empire, and they're up there talking about, you'll own nothing, you'll live in a pod, you'll eat bugs, you'll own nothing, and you'll be happy about it. And they're sitting there saying we need to heavy-handedly control the world economy, and we need to reduce the population. And the only way we're going to get out of this crisis is with mass destruction. Whereas you have a number of capitalists like Elon Musk, like Hobby Lobby, like Betsy DeVos that are saying, oh no, our profits have gone down so much. We need total deregulation. We need the government to just completely be cut out of the economy because that's the only way we can make any money, right? Our rate of profit has gone down. We need total deregulation. And as a result of that, you have a fight in the ruling class between the Malthusian ultra-rich and the libertarian new right. And that's what's going on across Europe. And the libertarian new right, they think, okay, let's do business with Russia and China. If we can make more money, they're just desperate to make more money. The managerial ultra-rich are saying the only way we can stabilize our system in the long term, we got to destroy Russia. We got to destroy China. We got to destroy all these countries and seize the whole world as our captive market. One group is thinking long-term. How do we control and stay at the top? And the other group is saying, we are so desperate to make money, we just need deregulation. If we trade with China, we trade with Russia, fine, as long as we can make money. That's the division. So what is the solution? We're saying that we don't need a Malthusian degrowth state, which is what the Democrats and the liberals and the globalists want. They want a state that will destroy the economy and destroy living standards and grind us all into poverty to stabilize the system while preparing for World War III. We obviously don't want that. However, we're not Elon Musk either. We don't believe that you can cut your way into economic growth, which is what they believe. They believe if you just get the government out, you get rid of all the jobs of government workers, you deregulate the economy, magically you'll have economic growth. And we don't believe in that either. You can't cut your way into economic growth. So we're not Malthusians in that we want a heavy-handed government to make everybody poorer. And we're not libertarians and free marketeers who think that the way to make economic growth is you just get the government out and you just, wreck the economy by getting rid of good paying government jobs and deregulating employment, etc. We're saying you need a government that punches up. And that's what we're saying is we say we need a government that will punch up and break the power of the big monopolies. We want a popular government, but we want a government that punches up. Not a government that punches down and not no government. We want a government that punches up. And that's the concept of a government of action. When we call for a government of action, that's what we're calling for. The model for a government of action is all the economies around the world that are not part of the Western system. The BRICS countries, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America, the Shia Axis of Resistance. All the socialist and anti-imperialist countries of the world all have governments that emerged from anti-colonial revolutions, and they have seized control of their economy with a state that controls the economy to create growth, not to degrow like the governments of the West, and not free markets, but rather they have a government that fights for the people against the big monopolies. They have a pro-growth, anti-austerity government rooted in an anti-colonial struggle, right? And, the Chinese Communist Party came to power fighting against the century of humiliation, fighting against the British Empire. The Eurasian Economic Union, that's, after Russia was devastated after the fall of the Soviet Union, Putin came in, he put oil and gas under public ownership and stabilized the economy with oil and gas revenue and rebuilt, you have the Bolivarian countries in response to neoliberalism across Latin America. Hugo Chavez came in and created a state that was controlling the oil revenue and was using the oil revenue to build things. The Islamic Revolution of Iran, they had a revolution and they kicked out the Western imperialists and they started using the oil to build up the economy. And that these are governments that emerged in struggles against colonialism and struggles against the Western system. And they are pro-growth governments. They're states that are basically have come to power on the basis of we're gonna organize the economy. And it's not the Soviet model. They have all kinds of private corporations. They've got all kinds of private businesses, but the state really controls things. And in Iran, it's about 50% state ownership. Even the private companies have to do what the state says. The biggest sector of the economy is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In Bolivarian countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they're Marxists and socialists, but there's a lot of private businesses, etc. But there's state banks that control the credit strings. There's state-controlled natural resources, and they're constantly planning out the economy to have economic growth. They have 5-year economic plans. All these countries basically have governments that came out of anti-colonial revolutions, that came into power fighting against the Western monopolies. And their entire selling point, the only way the Islamic Revolution in Iran is able to stay in power, the only way the Bolivarians are able to stay in power, the only way the Chinese communists are able to stay in power, the only way Putin and the Russian government are able to stay in power is by creating economic growth. They are obsessed with economic growth, and they have whole rooms where they sit and plan all day. How can we get the economy to grow? They are pro-growth governments. And we need such a government here in the United States. And the way to get that is to build an anti-monopoly coalition. It is only the big monopolies that want to degrow. They want the heavy-handed state that will degrow. And a lot of the people who oppose the big monopolies, they believe in deregulation and austerity. Well, they're delusional. That's not going to create economic growth. What we need is a government of action, a pro-growth, pro-humanity government. A government of action is a government that is opposed to the big monopolies, opposed to the imperialists, and organizes a block of different people from different classes, including some capitalists and corporations, small business owners, but the working class, the labor unions, etc., and organizes them to have a pro-growth state, a government of action, a government that is pro-economic growth, that will break the power of the big monopolies and ensure economic growth. That is what we need. And that is why we are innovationists, is that we want to unleash growth and innovation, but we know you need a government of action to do it. And that obviously the degrowth government, the Malthusian climate change liberal government isn't going to do it, but getting the government out of the economy and just having the government sit back and firing all the government employees, that's not going to do it either. Ultimately, we call for a government of action, a government that will get things done in order to ensure economic growth. So when we have our slogan, we need a government of action to fight for working families, what we're saying is we want a government that comes into power, breaks the power of the big monopolies, and uses the state, control of the banking sector, control of natural resources, and uses state control to stimulate innovation and stimulate economic growth. It has a 5-year economic plan and will make it its mission to oversee and facilitate economic growth in alliance with the various anti-colonial governments that have emerged throughout the 20th century, in alliance with China, with Russia, with Cuba, with Iran, with Venezuela, etc. We need a government of action that will fight for working families, that will break the power of the big monopolies, that will inject wealth and credit and stimulation and invest in America so that America can expand. That's what a government of action is. And that's why we call for a government of action. Ultimately, a government of action is a repudiation of liberalism. Liberalism says that the only thing the government should do is ensure your rights, is make sure no one messes with your property, make sure no one tells you what to think or what to say. We argue differently. We say the state has an obligation to mobilize society and facilitate economic growth. The state should be trying to make you a better person. The state should be trying to make you smarter. The state should try to make you healthier. The state has an obligation to try and make human beings better and stimulate productivity and make sure humanity can soar to new heights. We should have a pro-growth, pro-humanity state, a government of action. And that's what we're calling for. So when we say we have a government of action, we want a government of action to fight for working families, we are calling for something that is the opposite of neoliberalism, and it's the opposite of Malthusianism. It is a pro-growth government. And ultimately, we want to build the anti-monopoly coalition that will bring that into being. So I hope this was informative, and I hope this was educational, because we live in very, very confusing times. But ultimately, liberalism is at a dead end. The ideology of liberalism, it doesn't work anymore. And it's interesting because in Russia, Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher, he talks about what he calls the fourth political theory. He says that liberalism is the first political theory, and that communism was one attempt to deal with it. Fascism was another attempt to deal with it. And he argues that we're now entering, he says, what's rising around the world, in Russia, in China, in Iran, in Venezuela, that this new opposition, he calls it the fourth political theory, that is not purely communist or purely fascist. It's neither. It has elements of the left and the right, but it is against liberalism. And that's an observation that it's true. And the reason that, when I was in Venezuela and people told me to read Dugin, when I was in Iran, people told me to read Dugin, and when I actually read Dugin, I said, this guy knows what he's talking about, is that's true. And if you go to China, Mao Zedong and Confucius are everywhere. And the two guys were opposite of each other. Confucius was this traditionalist who was the father in a lot of ways of Chinese civilization. But he was a traditionalist. He believed in class society. He believed in patriarchy and filial piety and all this. Mao Zedong said it is right to rebel against reactionaries. But Mao and Confucius are both collectivists. They're not celebrating individuals. They're not liberals. And they're both part of China's unique identity that is in opposition to liberalism. And if you go to Russia, they admire the great czars, Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, etc. But at the same time, they also admire Stalin, and they admire the Soviet Union and everything they did. Well, the Soviet Union, those are the people that overthrew the czars. But they both believed in something that is not Western and is not liberal and is collectivist, right? The czars were fighting for the great Russian nation, feudalism, the Orthodox Church. Stalin was fighting for the international working class against imperialism, socialism, communism. Both of them are not liberalism, right? And that this is what is happening. And if you go to Latin America, if you go to Nicaragua, the government of Nicaragua, it's a Marxist government, a socialist government, but their slogan is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. They have some of the strictest anti-abortion laws in the world, and indigenous religion is blossoming there. A lot of indigenous, groups are sponsored by the government, etc. A lot of Pentecostal Christians, but also a lot of communists and Marxists, and they all kind of walk hand in hand because they're not Western, right? And in Iran, they're the Islamic Revolution of Iran. They are very opposed to communism and Marxism, very religious and very conservative. But they say not capitalism, but Islam, and they view their revolution as part of, the wave of anti-colonial revolutions. They have pictures of Malcolm X everywhere. They have pictures they have a street name for Bobby Sands, the IRA fighter. They admire, all kinds of anti-colonial fighters throughout human history. They funded the IRA. They funded Nelson Mandela. And their revolution that is anti-colonial, but also deeply religious and Shia Muslim, is collectivist and not Western. And I'm telling you that this is the way the world is going. Liberalism, the Western ideology that celebrates individualism above all else, it did some good things. Freedom of speech is great. Freedom of religion is great. Freedom of association. I believe you should be able to live your life as you want to live it. And ultimately, I believe you should be able to start your own business if you want. And I think the state should facilitate you being creative and starting your own business. However, in order to do that, there needs to be economic growth. And the free market does not create economic growth. It has this built-in problem of abundance created by poverty. And in order to develop economic growth, in order to have freedom, in order to have freedom of association, in order to have people live a comfortable life, you need a government of action. A government of action to control the means of production, to stimulate the economy with credit, to plan out the economy. You need a popular state that is in opposition to the big monopolies to make sure that that kind of economic growth happens. And that's what they have in the BRICS economy and in Russia and in China and in Venezuela and Iran, etc. And that's what we need. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need to defeat globalism, imperialism, and we need a state that will oversee economic growth. And the road to doing that is building an anti-monopoly coalition, which is what we should be striving to build. And the ideology that understands everything I just explained to you, right? Because these are all very important breakthroughs. The ideology that understands this is called innovationism, right? If people are just doing the communist thing, they're right about a lot of things. And this was Marxism. I talked about all of these Marxist concepts, all these Leninist concepts. But if you're just doing the Marxism thing, you don't quite get it. Innovationism is what I just preached to you. The understanding that you need a state to unleash human creativity, the understanding of neoliberalism, the understanding of the liberal ideology and its flaws. All of this is a unique perspective that comes from the Center for Political Innovation. We are tuned in with what they're doing in Russia. We are tuned in with what they're doing in China and Venezuela and Cuba and Iran. And if we were just doing the same old communist thing, we wouldn't be. And the reason all kinds of communists are confused and they're not supporting Russia in Ukraine and they're, obsessing over the trans thing and liberal cancel culture is because they don't have this understanding. They're stuck in the 20th century. We're not in the 20th century anymore. This is the 21st century. This is 2025. We're 1/4 of a way into the 20th century, in the 21st century. The world is very different than it used to be. A lot has happened since the fall of the Soviet Union. A lot has happened since World War II. A lot has happened since the 1930s, and we need an up-to-date understanding of what is going on. Where did the computer revolution come from? All of this. This is a new synthesis, right? Innovationism is a new stage. And if you are an innovationist, you are on the cutting edge. You are doing something new and exciting. And that's why we're at the center of everything important. And that's why all the phonies and frauds are always trying to catch up with us and copy what we're doing and find a way to do what we do, but weaponize it against us on social media or whatever. No one is innovating in the way that we are innovating. We are innovating because our entire philosophy understands that innovation is the future and that the brilliance of human beings is our ability to innovate. We are innovationists. Long live innovationism. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That is my slideshow for you all tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. Names and locations, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us? Mark Jones in Utica, New York is with us. Lawrence Johnson in Chicago is with us. Great speech. Kinkle. Beijing. Marge. Good to have you with us. Ian Chester in England. JT24 in Mississippi. Juanito in Peru. Rory in St. Louis. Douglas in Northern California. Courtney in Northern Virginia. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Alex in Brazil. Brad in Cleveland. Dahe in Seattle. Christopher Anthony from Seattle. Saviero in Mexico. Domingo, New Jersey. Hi, Caleb. Well, hey, how you doing? Jacob in Wisconsin. Jim in Chicago. Peter in Sweden. Owen from the 51st state. Auckland, New Zealand. Chicago. I'm a proud innovationist, pro-growth. Gabby is awesome. St. David's, Bermuda. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Patrick in Maine is with us. St. David's, Bermuda. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who's with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Ellie in Chicago. Welcome, Ellie. Richard from Chula Vista, California. Very, very good. Ed in Louisville. Yep, there are many Americans that don't have anything to do. They ain't got nothing to do. RSFO from Copenhagen. Bendigo, Australia, David Fox. Bixie from San Francisco, California. Welcome, Bixie. Riverside, Californian, Justin Rivera. Anybody else? Names and locations. Let me see. Oh, we got a Rumble. Oh, we got a number of Rumble rants here. We got what? All right. On Rumble rants, we got Kinky. We got Kinky again. We got Anoan. Okay, so we got 3 Rumble rants, and we got 4 questions to answer. So I'm going to make a point of answering those questions. But if you got any more super chats or Rumble rants, by all means, please send them in. I generally play music during this time. That's generally what I do. So I'm going to give you all another opportunity to think of a question to ask or whatever. And I'm going to play one of my favorite Chinese songs, which is actually Tibetan. It's from the region of Tibet. I'm going to play a couple versions of it. And if I can find the version of it I've played on here before, I would love to play that. But it is a Tibetan melody that was kind of they adopted it. The Chinese communists adopted it, and they turned it into a Chinese communist song called "Golden Mountain in Beijing," which is I think it's just a beautiful, haunting melody. So I'm going to put on a couple different versions of Golden Mountain in Beijing, because I just absolutely love this song. FYI, there is no Golden Mountain in Beijing. The song is it's just about, it's a Maoist communist song about, Mao is awesome or whatever, and they called it Golden Mountain in Beijing, even though there is actually no Golden Mountain in Beijing. And it's a Tibetan traditional melody that they just wrote, and they called it Golden Mountain in Beijing. So I'm gonna put a couple different versions of it on. So yeah, this is Golden Mountain in Beijing. I'm not hearing any music. I'm sorry, that version must not have had any sound. That's rather odd. There we go. Okay, sorry. Now we'll do a version with sound, right? Okay. This may not be the best version of it, but there's many versions of Golden Mountain in Beijing out there. We'll play a couple different ones because it's just one of those beautiful, haunting melodies. It's a Tibetan melody, Golden Mountain in Beijing. Here we go. Okay, why is it not playing any sound? That's so weird. The video on my computer has sound. Why is it not playing any sound? That is extremely odd. I have never had this problem before. All right, let's find a version that we can play the sound with. That is extremely weird. I have never had it not play the sound when I put a video on, but that's okay. All right. We'll do another version of it. Okay. I really like this song. I really do. It's a favorite of mine. And you'll like it too. You'll find the melody to be enjoyable if I can get StreamYard to cooperate. And please send more super chats in. Give me something to talk about in the second half of the show. I'm counting on y'all to do that. So here we go. Downloading another version. Why is it being annoying? I'm having bad luck with music tonight. All right. I have never seen anything like this. This is very, very annoying. But we will survive. We will get through this. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Technical difficulties. Technical difficulties. Wow. All right, here we go. All right. So the video does have sound. I don't know if it's a problem with this computer or what, but hopefully it plays. There we go.
把凡是农奴的心儿照亮，我们迈步走在社会主义幸福的大道上，黑板沙黑。 给中国共产党。嘿，巴扎嘿。北京的金山上光芒照四方，毛主席就是那金色的太阳，多么温暖，多么慈祥，把凡是农奴的心儿照亮。我们迈步走在社会主义幸福的大道上，嘿巴扎嘿。北京的金山上光芒照四方，毛泽东思想哺育我们成长，翻身农奴斗志昂扬，建设社会主义的新西藏。颂歌献给毛主席，颂歌献给中国共产党。嘿巴扎嘿。
So there you go. So we'll do another version of it now. We'll do the version. This is one of my favorite composers, Cornelius Cardew. This is his version of it. Yeah, that's good stuff. That's great stuff. All right. All righty. So now we're going to start answering. We'll do Rumble rants first. Then from there, we will go on to answer the super chats. So keep the super chats rolling in. Kinky2 asks, is it fair for me to define workers as those who must work for a living without saying PMC or bourgeois or petty bourgeois? Well, that's interesting. So, and you think about the working class, you're talking about wage workers, proletarians, people who sell their labor power. However, you have the small business owner who owns their own business. And that one thing that Peter Coffin and I have talked endlessly about is that there is a lot of overlap between the petty bourgeoisie and the gig economy worker. Even though they are technically workers, they're being exploited by big corporations, etc. They still have to go out and hustle. They compete with other gig economy workers. It's very much, we're in a new situation, and that's why a lot of the classic Marxist stuff doesn't quite work. And the rise of Javier Milei in Argentina was largely gig economy guys who identify as small business owners. And that's a big problem. Generally Marxists have referred to the working class, referring to the proletariat, which generally meant factory workers. And they've also referred to working people, and working people could be small business owners. They could be peasants. Working people meant anyone who works for a living. And that, bourgeoisie or capitalist generally refers to the owning class, those who, it's not simply that they own a business, but it's that they just live because they have property. Those who, they live off the revenue that's constantly coming in from what they own on paper. That's how all of these things are explained. Ultimately, we need to be focusing on having a pro-growth government, and a government that is controlling the economy to make sure there is growth. And that there is a small class of people that does not want that because it is in their interest to maintain their monopoly by preventing and halting and freezing economic growth. And that the polarization is more about pro-growth and anti-growth, and that we're building an alliance of producers, an alliance of builders. And in order to have growth, you're going to have central planning of the economy. So there you go. Why do so many billionaires demand more people, e.g. through undocumented immigration? Why are they Malthusian? It doesn't make business sense. Well, here's the thing, right? More people means more competition for jobs, means they can pay less. It means that they can pay everyone less, right? And that it's, first of all, not every billionaire is anti-growth. I mean, the people that are anti-growth are the ultra rich, but there's, many billionaires who just want to make money, right? And that, there's an old saying, they say, every year Forbes magazine publishes a list of the richest people in the world. And that list is bullshit. And in fact, all the people on that list are so poor that they keep their money in their own name. And that the richest of the rich, no one knows how much money they have. There are no Rockefellers on that Forbes, richest of the rich list. Well, John D. Rockefeller was the richest person in history, and his family and their wealth and their influence has been expanding. And when one of his descendants was, becoming the vice president, I believe, was being, confirmed by Congress, they couldn't figure out how much money he had because it was so tied up in so many elaborate trusts and all of that. And he was on the board of so many corporations and foundations and all of that. And no one knows how much money the Rockefellers have. They have so much money, they don't know. Nobody knows. But they're not on the list of richest man in the world with Carlos Slim and Bill Gates. They're not on that list. And you think about the DuPonts and the Carnegies and the Mellons and the people like that. They're so wealthy that their wealth is incalculable. If their wealth is calculable, they're not really the ultra rich, right? They might work for the ultra rich, right? Jeff Bezos is very, very wealthy. He's a billionaire. but he was created by the intelligence apparatus and by the U.S. government, and that there was a lot of people wealthier than Jeff Bezos who enabled him to start Amazon and opened a lot of doors and used the government and the Defense Department and all kinds of things to let Amazon be set up. And Jeff Bezos isn't the guy who's really calling the shots, because there are much bigger forces that have lots of money and control lots of corporations and lots of banks that could undo him in a moment if they wanted, right? He's somebody that they built up for their own reasons and let him have Amazon. And that, you know, when we think of billionaires, we're the people that you think of, right, are not who we're thinking of. I would recommend, there's a book called The Rich and the Ultra Rich by Ferdinand Lundberg. He also has a book called Rockefeller Syndrome. And you read those books and you get a sense of, you know, like the Rockefeller family. For every one of these wealthy families, there's like a circle of families that surround them, right? And, you know, it's like they talk about the 60 families that rule America, but each of them has a layer of families that like surround them and work for them. And the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Vanderbilts, the Rothschilds, you know, I mean, these people are, you know, they're not on any of the lists of richest people because their personal taxable income that they report is not very high. It's maybe only a couple $2 billion or something, right? So they're not on the list of that rich because their wealth is so vast and so, you know, it's spread out, and it's you know, they're beyond rich. Read Ferdinand Lundberg. That's who I would point you towards, right? If you want to know who's really rich in America and how the rich operate, that's what I would point you towards. Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of billionaires, they just want people to work for them. The other thing is that the H-1 visa thing serves intelligence purposes. That's about brain drain. The way they weaken countries in the developing world is they lure all their engineers and scientists here. And a lot of developing countries, even, you know, not communist or, you know, even really anti-imperialist ones, India, Nigeria, countries like that, will spend a lot of money to train their people to be doctors, to train their people to be engineers, because they need those kind of folks if they're going to build infrastructure and develop their economy. And what happens is the United States then brings those people to the United States, and their country stays underdeveloped. Brain drain is not simply about stripping communist countries of smart and educated people. It's about stripping the entire developing world of those folks. And it's also about making sure that we don't have such people arise from our own population. Here in America, our education is shit. And that's fine for them, right? Because if we started developing engineers and scientists and smart people over here, we'd start saying, hey, this isn't right the way we're set up, and we would have a problem. But if we import a bunch of people from the developing world, they're not going to ask any questions, because over here they're making a higher standard of living than they ever make back home. So they're just going to be happy with their high standard of living, and they're not going to complain. And the brain drain system that HB1 is set up for, you know, it is, the brain drain system is very, very, very much to the benefit of globalism, imperialism, and bad for developing countries and bad for the working people of the Western countries. And I've talked about this many times. All right. And great lecture. Beat all of my history professors from school. From your historical understanding, where did wokeism come from? Well, I generally say that there's 3 stages of wokeism. Wokeism started out in the 1950s with the Frankfurt School and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and that the CIA realized that in order to defeat the Soviet Union and to defeat communism, they needed to start cultivating their own communists and their own leftists. And so with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, they started subsidizing the work of Theodore Adorno and Susan Sontag and Irving Howe and all kinds of leftists who were anti-communist. And they subsidized them as a way that one could be a leftist and be on the side of the American government in the Cold War. And there was a whole layer of socialists, Trotskyists, anarchists, people like that were subsidized and promoted by the American government with Partisan Review magazine, the Frankfurt School, Der Monat, Encounter magazine. And it was all part of like an operation to recruit intellectuals and left-wing kind of people into being anti-communist, to mess with, because the way the place that communists were recruiting and were popular was the intellectual circles, academics. Albert Einstein was sympathetic to the Communist Party. Oppenheimer and Will Geer, the actor, and what's his name? Aaron Copland, the musician. And they wanted to create space between intellectuals and communists. So they created what I talk about, like the synthetic left. They created the new left, which was a kind of an anti-communist, pro-imperialist, but left breakaway intellectual formation that was created by American intelligence. And it was largely emphasizing nonconformity as a form of anti-fascism rather than the economics. And it kind of saw populism as dangerous. It was anti-populist. You read Theodor Adorno's Authoritarian Personality. You read Hannah Arendt and her Eichmann in Jerusalem. You read Susan Sontag and her Fascinating Fascism. The people are the enemy, right? It's fascism, and communism is nothing but the most, communism is fascism in their mind. The Soviet Union is the same as Nazi Germany, and they're expressions of when the rabble get together and start threatening the intellectuals. And populism is a danger. Populism is inherently anti-Semitic. Populism is inherently totalitarian, etc. That's the beginning. The next stage is they create the color revolution apparatus. They start weaponizing these people to go to communist countries and destabilize them with protests. And they're courting the young intellectuals in the communist countries, recruiting them to protest against the communist governments, to destabilize them, etc. Not in the name of capitalism, but in the name of freedom. If they had gone to these people and said, "Oh, we hate communism and we're for the Western system," they wouldn't have gotten any audience. But by saying, "Oh, we're not pro-Soviet or pro-Western. We're for democratic socialism. We're for Trotskyism. We're for anarchy and revolution from below and artistic freedom." And, it was like they started using this new left to cultivate a layer of people in the communist countries that were their allies, that were their, they're useful idiots, basically. In the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, George Soros is funding art galleries and movie studios in the former Soviet Union, etc. That's stage 2. Stage 3 is that in the aftermath of the economic crisis and the financial meltdown of 2008, they brought the color revolution apparatus back to the United States to try and push through a degrowth agenda. And they brought all the George Soros color revolution, Revolution Incorporated, social justice warrior people. It was brought back to the United States, and they used social media, etc., to create an army of people to try and force a degrowth agenda to stabilize capitalism in the aftermath of the economic crisis. And that's where wokeism is. Wokeism is like the third step, right? First, they were just messing with leftism. Then they were creating like a global destabilization revolution intelligence apparatus. Then they brought it home to try and force their agenda on U.S. society after the economic crisis. No, that's where wokeism came from, I know, and I hope that answer is helpful. Hempcar says, saw a video today of Jane Fonda on The View talking about murdering Trump supporters. I'm starting to think she's been FBI since day one, spreading extremism. I don't think so. I think she's from a Hollywood family. All right, she's from California. Her father was a very important Hollywood actor. And, when she was a young woman, Maoist communism was quite popular in Southern California, in Los Angeles, etc. And for a period, she was hanging out with Maoists. She was hanging out with the Revolutionary Union. She made films with Jean-Luc Godard. She ended up marrying Tom Hayden, who was a leader of Students for a Democratic Society. And she supported the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. She gave interviews opposing left adventurism. She denounced the Weather Underground and gave a very ideological, like Marxist interview denouncing them, which is actually quite interesting. And she went around urging U.S. soldiers to defect from the U.S. Army. She did some important work because there were many people. I mean, during these years, you had people like, was it Philip Agee or one of these CIA agents who just went to Cuba and switched sides, right? And you had a lot of people because the global anti-imperialist movement was so strong and the West was so confused and didn't quite know what to do about it. There were a number of people among the rich and powerful. I mean, I think all the Weather Underground terrorists, many of them were from billionaire families and from, members of Congress and rich people. And there were just various people that, that thought the communists were going to win the Cold War and switch sides. And Jane Fonda was one of those. And then throughout the 70s, things started to change, and it didn't look like the communists were going to win. And then she was pro-Israel, and she's in Hollywood, and Hollywood is very much pro-Israel territory. And then in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, she and Tom Hayden, who had both been Maoist communists, went around urging communists to support Israel. And they did a campus speaking tour urging communists to support Israel. After that, from what I understand, her marriage to Tom Hayden kind of went sour, and she soured on leftism for a while, and then she married Ted Turner, who was a libertarian. Ted Turner was really into Ayn Rand and had like billboards about John Galtz and all of that. And so she had like a libertarian phase where, it was the Reagan years. She was quite conservative in the 80s, from what I understand. Is that when she married Ted Turner? I'm just looking this up. I know she was married to Tom Hayden, and up into the 80s, she was married to Tom Hayden, if I'm not mistaken. But then, yeah, she married Ted Turner for a while, and Ted Turner was very into Ayn Rand and, libertarianism and stuff like that. And, and I mean, more recently, I know she was doing like exercise videos and stuff. And then, she started acting again after that, right? If I'm not mistaken, she started doing acting again recently, and now she's in DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and she has like a feminist podcast about being a feminist, and she has a boomer audience. She's a boomer, and it's just, she's there for like old boomers who might be conspiracy oriented, who might remember the anti-Vietnam War days, to urge them to have Trump derangement syndrome. I mean, that's really what I would argue that she's there to do. She's there to, she and Gloria Steinem are very close. Gloria Steinem was a founder of DSA, is on the national board of DSA. And, she is basically just, she's there to be a woke liberal. I don't know what to say about it, yeah, I mean, there's not much more to it. So, I mean, yeah. So yeah, she was a huge supporter of Israel. So yeah. I mean, I guess she's changed her view of Israel more recently, which is interesting. She's taking more of a Noam Chomsky view of Israel. That's interesting. Well, okay. Interesting. Yeah, but that's Jane Fonda. And no, I don't think she's an agent. I just think she's a liberal Hollywood person, and she was a liberal Hollywood Zionist. I guess her views have started to shift. She's more, I don't know. Anyway, that's Jane Fonda. All right, so now we're going to start doing super chats. If anyone wants to send in any more super chats, send them in. Since Trump wants peace in Ukraine, what now with Israel-Palestine conflict? How can we explain it to folks, especially conservatives? Well, Trump's plans for Israel-Palestine are horrible. They're absolutely horrendous. No endorsement to that. I mean, it's horrifying. But that said, I mean, and to be fair, I mean, the same stuff he's saying about Zelensky, he could say to Netanyahu. It's just, there's a lot of people in the Trump camp that are super pro-Israel, so he's very afraid to say that. But yeah, I mean, if anything, we can use whatever happens with Zelensky and the way they're talking about it, say, hey, and the same applies to Israel. Say to all your conservative friends who like what he's saying to Zelensky, say, well, what about Netanyahu? He's basically doing the same thing. I think that's a conversation starter. There you go. By the way, Elon Musk needs to shut the fuck up. I can't stand him. Yeah, I mean, occasionally he will say things I agree with. I've retweeted him before, but at the same time, he believes in libertarianism. He believes you can just cut the government's role in the economy, and that, no, you cannot. No, you cannot. There you go. Hey, Caleb, it would be a good time to simply explain what fascism is. Well, fascism, when it really gets down to it, is a mass mobilization, building a mass movement, and using the state to impose degrowth economics. That's really what it is. It's using the state to impose degrowth. And I mean, the Nazis, they created a network of concentration camps. They drove women out of the workforce. They broke the labor unions. They created a slave labor underclass, and it was a way of stabilizing the German economy for a couple of years. There's examples of this, but fascism is a heavy-handed state imposing dramatic degrowth economics to stabilize capitalism. The book on that is R. Palm Dutt, Fascism and Social Revolution, is the book. Fascism is rooted in the breakdown of capitalism, and it is about economics, and it's not an ideology. And all the ideology that fascists have is always they're playing catch up. They've decided what they're going to do, and then they create an ideology to justify it. And people who look for the definition of fascism in ideology are completely wrong. But the fascists will make up whatever they want to justify what they're doing, right? Someone could do fascism in the name of anti-racism. Someone could do it in the name of racism. Someone could do it in the name of this or that, right? But fascists make up something to justify what they're doing. And the people that think that fascism is an aesthetic or fascism is a certain set of beliefs, it is not any of those things. Fascism is using the state to try and stabilize capitalism with heavy-handed degrowth. And if you want a thorough understanding of that, read Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. All right. I have no idea what this means. I assume that's some kind of meme, or it's something that I'm going to take it off the screen here. It's something like you're trolling me or something. I have no clue what that means. I just don't know what it means. So if that's some dog whistle or some signal or something, okay, well, you super chatted it. I'm not endorsing whatever it is. Yeah, there you go. Do you think the EU countries are continuing to arm Ukraine to goad Russia into attacking them and drag the USA into a hot war? I don't think they really have the ability. There's this talk of like Britain sending its military to Ukraine, and there's all kinds of British generals saying that that's not possible. Like that, this is like once the USA pulls out of Ukraine, it's over. And, that's just the reality of the situation. And that there's a lot of Ukraine skepticism in Europe, and the rise of the new right, etc., is largely Ukraine skepticism. So I think there's a lot of bluster right now. But yeah, Britain can't even defend itself. I don't think that they're going to send troops to Ukraine, and no, not going to happen. However, I'd like to see this war actually end. I'm really glad to see Zelensky get smacked down, but I want to see the war actually end, right? I mean, the war needs to actually end. They need to sign a treaty and end the war. And that, statements are nice, but I want this war to actually end, right? And there needs to just be an agreement to end this war. So, I'm still holding my breath. It ain't over till it's over. And I'm happy. I'm really, really happy with what I was in DC to be there for. I didn't realize what I was going to. I knew there was going to be some mineral deal. Well, there was no mineral deal. There was no mineral deal. And Zelensky got smacked down, and I was really glad to be there. And I'm looking forward to interviewing, Truth Conductor. I was outside the White House and all that. But at the same time, I'll feel much better when the war actually ends. The war needs to actually end. Then I will feel better. But until then, if the war is not actually ending, we can't, gestures are nice. There was a lot of gestures from the Kennedy administration and from the Carter administration toward the Soviet Union. A lot of statements were made, but we still, look what happened, right? Gestures are nice. Words are nice. Needs to happen. And we're moving in a good direction. I like what I'm hearing around Ukraine, but it needs to happen. And we need to keep up the drumbeat. We can't turn it off, right? We got to amp up the volume, to show public support for it. The Ukrainians are losing their minds right now, which is good. It's a good sign. And the angrier they get, the more hopeful I will be. I guess I do want to remind you all that we are having our convention in Chicago in July. And this is the event to go to. If you want to fly to an event for CPI, this is the one to come to, right? It's at a hotel near the O'Hare Airport. It's at the Midwest Conference Center. The address is right there. This is where we need you to go to. If you come to one CPI event in the entire year of 2025, this is the one to go to. It's going to be absolutely awesome. And we need you there. And we're building for it. And we got to fill up that auditorium. It's not going to be easy to get the 400 people we want there, but we can do it. I am confident that we can do it. We will get our crowd of 400 people. We will do it. So register. David Fox is going to be there. So come and see David Fox. He's an awesome guy, right? But yes, register and be there. Be there. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be all about innovationism. We're building a movement here. Dare to struggle, dare to win, folks. And we are doing it. So I'm going to put on the closing music and we'll be back tomorrow. So I do this thing where I have like compilation videos that stream or that premiere all day. I'm going to do that tomorrow, and I might stream after that. We shall see. We shall see. But yeah, folks, our organization is marching ahead.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.